The cafe went quiet. A sudden slam of the officer's hand on the table made cups rattle and papers flutter. "You can't sit there," the officer barked, looming over a man who had been quietly sipping his coffee. The man didn't flinch. He didn't argue. He simply looked up, calm and unshaken. What the officer didn't know, what no one in that cafe realized yet, was that this quiet, unassuming man was Will Smith. It had started as any ordinary morning. Will had chosen a small, cozy cafe downtown to escape the constant glare of cameras and the endless fanfare that followed him everywhere. Hoodie drawn low, cap shading his face. No bodyguards, just a man enjoying a quiet moment. The officer, however, had walked in with the kind of authority that demands compliance. His eyes scanned the room, searching for someone to assert control over. And he landed on Will. "You don't belong here," the officer snapped, stepping closer. Will raised his eyes slowly, calm and measured. "I'm just finishing my coffee," he said softly. The officer mistook the calm for defiance. "Move," he demanded, slamming his hand onto the table. The room froze. Phones lifted, conversations paused, eyes widened. Will's composure didn't waver. He didn't need to shout. He didn't need to react. His quiet presence was enough. The officer, frustrated, leaned in closer. "You think you can talk back to me?" he growled. Will's gaze didn't falter. "I'm not talking back. I'm asking for a moment of respect," he said, his voice calm, measured. The tension in the room escalated. Patrons were frozen, sensing a collision about to happen. Authority versus calm, aggression versus composure. The officer, losing patience, grabbed Will's ID roughly. "What's your name?" "Who do you think you are?" he demanded. The barista stepped forward nervously. "Sir, maybe you're overreacting." The officer waved him away. "Stay out of it." Coffee spilled. A cup tipped over as the officer gestured aggressively. The room gasped. Phones started recording. The air felt electric. And then it happened. The moment of recognition. Someone in the cafe whispered, "Wait, isn't that Will Smith?" Heads turned. Phones zoomed in. Whispers grew louder. The officer's eyes widened as he finally looked at the man he had been humiliating. It was Will Smith. The quiet man he thought was ordinary was one of the most recognizable people on the planet. The officer's eyes widened. Every instinct he had, every ounce of assumed authority, faltered under that recognition. He had humiliated a man he assumed was ordinary, quiet, meek, easy to push around. Instead, he was standing over one of the most recognized faces in the world, a man whose presence alone could fill stadiums, command cameras, and shift crowds with a single glance. The realization hit him like a punch. And yet, Will didn't move aggressively. He didn't raise his voice. He simply remained composed, letting the weight of the situation speak for itself. The room felt it too. Every patron, barista, and passerby frozen in silent awe, sensing the shift in power without a single shout or display of force. Someone near the back of the cafe whispered, almost too quietly to be heard, "That's Will Smith, he's just sitting there?" Heads swiveled. Phones rose. Cameras zoomed in. The world outside that cafe would see it soon, though the patrons didn't know it yet. The officer's breathing became uneven. His confidence, which had seemed unshakable moments ago, crumbled under the silent authority of the man he had humiliated. You're Will Smith," he stammered, voice cracking slightly. Will nodded slowly, almost imperceptibly. "Yes," he said quietly. "And that should have changed how you treated me." The officer opened his mouth, tried to respond, but no words came. The tension didn't break. It thickened. The spilled coffee, the scattered napkins, the murmur of shocked patrons, all of it hung in the air like a living thing. Will bent slightly to gather his belongings, moving slowly, deliberately, with no rush, no aggression, no spectacle. Every motion was calculated, every gesture calm. It wasn't a display of force. It was a display of presence. And it hit the officer harder than any confrontation could. In the background, patrons whispered, some pointing, some recording, some just frozen in disbelief. The realization spread across the room. This was not just a man. This was someone who had mastered control over situations far larger than this cafe, someone whose calm could shift entire narratives. The officer's colleagues who had been present began to murmur among themselves. Some of them realized they had been witnessing an unintentional lesson in humility. Some were fearful of what could come next. Will finally straightened, putting his bag over his shoulder. You don't need to prove authority by humiliating someone, he said, voice low, calm, yet charged with undeniable presence. The officer's jaw tightened. He realized that he had just been schooled without the man ever raising a hand. The room's atmosphere shifted again. People who had been tense with fear now felt a sense of awe. Some patrons whispered, "I've never seen anyone handle that so calmly." Others said, "That's real power." The officer tried to reclaim control. I was just." Well, didn't need to hear him out. He didn't even flinch. Instead, he simply nodded to the spilled coffee, picked up his cup, and wiped it with a napkin. No words were wasted. Every eye in the cafe was on him. Every subtle motion amplified his authority. The officer's authority, once absolute, had evaporated. Outside, the world was about to see what had happened. Someone had captured the encounter on phone. By the time Will exited the cafe, the video had already started circulating. Headlines would appear within hours. Police officer humiliates quiet man. Doesn't realize it's Will Smith. Actor handles confrontation calmly. Authority collapses. Cafe showdown goes viral. Calm beats aggression. But inside the cafe, the tension hadn't left immediately. Even after Will left, patrons lingered, reliving the confrontation in their minds. They whispered to each other, not about the humiliation, not about the authority, but about the power of composure. The power of composure lingered in the cafe long after Will Smith had walked out. Chairs remained slightly askew. Napkins fluttered from the spill, half stuck to the table. Patrons sipped their coffee cautiously, almost reverently, as if breathing too hard might undo the lesson they had just witnessed. The officer, still frozen in place near the counter, stared at the empty doorway. His hands twitched, ready to assert himself, but the memory of Will's calm gaze held him back. It wasn't fear exactly. It was a strange mix of awe, disbelief, and the creeping realization that everything he had relied on to command authority had failed spectacularly. He had humiliated the wrong man. The quiet, unassuming figure had dominated the space without raising a hand. Outside, the city pulsed normally, unaware of the seismic event that had just occurred within that small cafe. Yet inside, everyone who had witnessed it felt a shift, not just in the way they looked at authority, but in themselves. A young woman at the corner table, sipping tea, whispered to her friend, "Did you see that? He didn't even yell, and yet he owned the room." Her friend nodded. "I've never seen anything like it." That's respect in motion. Even the regulars, the patrons who came every day for croissants and coffee, were silent for a moment, digesting the scene. They realized that what had just unfolded wasn't about celebrity. It wasn't about fame. It was about how a person carries themselves under pressure. The officer, meanwhile, shuffled toward the back, away from witnesses. Alone for the first time since entering the cafe, he replayed the incident in his mind. Each detail was etched like a blueprint. The tilt of Will's head, the calm but piercing gaze, the slow, deliberate movement to collect his cup, the way the room had shifted without any physical confrontation. He had entered expecting compliance. He had walked out confronted by mastery disguised as calm. The next day, the video from the cafe began circulating online. The moment went viral almost immediately. People were captivated not by the humiliation of the officer, but by the quiet dominance of Will Smith. Social media erupted. He didn't need to fight. He just was. Composure beats aggression every single time. This is why he's a master of presence. Journalists reached out to the cafe owner for statements. Patrons were interviewed for reactions. The officer himself was called into internal review, but even those reviewing him couldn't help but acknowledge the lesson that had unfolded. Will, as always, remained unreachable for comment. He didn't post about it on Instagram. He didn't hold a press conference. He knew the lesson didn't require amplification. It was already doing its work. Meanwhile, in the officer's department, discussions began quietly but urgently. The footage was shared internally as a case study. The lessons were clear. Authority without awareness is hollow. Aggression can crumble under quiet strength. Respect cannot be demanded, it must be earned. The officer sat in mandatory reflection sessions, struggling to reconcile his ego with the reality of the encounter. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw Will's eyes, calm, unwavering, unshakable. The cafe itself became a minor pilgrimage site. Visitors would come, hoping to see the table where Will had claimed authority with nothing but presence. Some patrons started leaving small notes on the wall. Strength is measured in restraint. Composure beats chaos. Quiet wins louder than yelling. The small establishment had been transformed overnight from a local coffee spot into a symbol of restraint, poise, and unexpected power. Weeks later, a media outlet contacted Will's team, seeking an interview about the incident. He declined. Instead, he continued his normal routine: workouts, script meetings, and family time. He understood that influence is most profound when it doesn't scream for attention. Yet the city, and soon the world, would continue to replay that short cafe clip for months. Every replay reinforced the same lesson. Power isn't always physical, and authority isn't always loud. Months passed. The officer, still humbled, slowly began to reflect on his own behavior. He started training in conflict resolution. He studied ways to assert authority without overstepping boundaries. He became quieter, more attentive, and more measured in public interactions. It wasn't immediate. Growth never is. But every step reminded him of that one calm man in the cafe who had undone years of misplaced confidence in seconds. Meanwhile, patrons continued to recount the story. The teenager who had filmed the encounter shared the clip with friends. The barista told the story to new hires. Regulars whispered about the lesson in composure to anyone who would listen. And every single recounting emphasized the same points. Calm is not weakness. Presence is more commanding than shouting. One person, even in a small cafe, can shift the energy of a room without lifting a hand. The incident became more than a viral clip. It became a case study in leadership, influence, and restraint. Business schools began using the story in ethics and management classes. Leadership podcasts analyzed it. Even law enforcement seminars began sharing the footage, emphasizing authority is not dominance. Composure is control. Meanwhile, Will Smith's life continued as normal, but the ripples of that day continued to expand in subtle ways. Fans spoke of it in interviews. Colleagues referenced it in private conversations. Aspiring actors and public figures watched the clip repeatedly to study his calm under pressure. None of it changed Will's day-to-day life, yet the encounter had etched an enduring lesson into the public consciousness. Back at the cafe, the small table remained, carefully cleaned, now slightly scarred by the spilled coffee that had become a symbol of an unforgettable lesson. Customers would still glance at it, silently acknowledging the tension that had once filled the air. The memory of the confrontation, though gone in moments, had transformed everyone who had witnessed it. The officer never returned. The lesson endured. The video continued to circulate globally. Replays focused on the calm gaze. Slow-motion clips highlighted the deliberate movements. Commentators dissected how one man had asserted dominance without aggression. The lesson was clear: power is subtle, authority is fragile, and composure is unstoppable. And somewhere, far from the cameras, Will continued his life, unaware of how many people were quietly studying the way he had held the room. No shouting, no drama, no spectacle, only presence. And that, more than any headline or viral clip, was the victory that mattered.